I think we have to have a talk about your spending practices. You find a lot of...
Oh, I know.
How much have you spent on property the last 2 years, right?
Chris Doumit didn't just lose money on Oak Island. He burned through millions in a way that leaves a mark. Not the kind of loss mining companies casually label as investment costs, but the kind that's visible, documented, and hard to shake off. The kind that strains partnerships, tests personal relationships, and quietly follows your reputation long after the season ends. In the mining world, people had an opinion about him after those setbacks. It wasn't harsh. The Klondike doesn't waste energy on cruelty. But it was firm. The ground had delivered its verdict, and in their eyes, Chris had heard it. The logical move? Walk away and choose a different path. He didn't. Instead of quitting, Chris went back to the dirt. Not the same claim, a new one. A place no one else wanted. Ground buried under more than 100 feet of stubborn overburden. A layer that had discouraged every serious attempt to explore what lay beneath. Most saw it as a dead end. But beneath that uninviting surface sat something extraordinary. Roughly $300 million in gold, untouched, hidden under geology so discouraging that it had effectively protected the treasure from everyone, except someone willing to push past 100 feet of nothing. Chris Doumit was that someone, maybe stubborn, maybe desperate, maybe both. And that's exactly why this story matters, because going from financial collapse to uncovering hundreds of millions in gold isn't just a comeback. It's one of the most dramatic turnarounds in mining history. Let's start with the losses. They didn't hit all at once. That's how serious failure usually works in mining. Not as a single disaster, but as a slow buildup. Small setbacks stack on top of each other until suddenly you're too deep to recover. Chris didn't come into mining blindly. He had real strengths, just not the traditional kind. He wasn't raised in the Klondike. He didn't grow up around heavy equipment or spend decades reading ground by instinct. What he brought instead was business intelligence, financial strategy, deal-making skills, and the ability to attract serious investment. He understood money. He knew how to structure opportunities and convince investors the risk was worth it. What he was still learning was the ground itself. Because the Klondike doesn't behave the way spreadsheets say it should. Equipment reacts differently under real conditions. Geological surveys can mislead, and the gap between expected gold and actual recovery can be devastating. His first operation looked solid on paper. The surveys were done right. The plan made sense. The equipment matched the scale, but the gold wasn't there, at least not in the quantities promised, not completely absent, just frustratingly close. Enough to keep hope alive, not enough to make the operation profitable. That's the worst kind of situation, because it convinces you to keep going just a little longer, even when every extra day is digging you deeper into losses. Chris didn't quit mid-season. He pushed harder. He reworked the plan again and again. He brought in experts, paid for more analysis, adjusted operations wherever he could. But effort couldn't close the gap. By the end of the season, the numbers didn't work. There was gold, just not enough to sustain the cost of running a serious mining operation. His investors understood the risks. The Klondike always comes with uncertainty, but understanding risk doesn't erase disappointment. The losses were real, and so was the tension that followed. Season 2 was supposed to fix things. Instead, it made everything worse. The operation was scaled down to cut costs. Focus shifted to the most promising areas based on previous data. On paper, it was smarter, tighter, more controlled. But then came the kind of bad luck that struggling operations can't afford. Critical equipment failed at the worst possible time. Repairs drained the financial buffer meant to last the entire season. Production time shrank. Recovery numbers dropped below even the reduced operating costs. Now, it wasn't just a tough season, it was a breaking point. 2 seasons of losses piled up into something that couldn't be ignored. The operation shut down. Investor relationships fractured beyond repair. And within the mining community, Chris's name was quietly filed away under a familiar category. He tried, he failed, the ground decided, case closed. Except, it wasn't. Because while his main operation was struggling, Chris had been studying something else. A different claim. One that everyone else had already written off. land buried under 100 feet of overburden, so unappealing that geologists across the region had basically agreed it wasn't worth the effort, but Chris saw it differently. After 2 seasons of expensive lessons, he had gained something he didn't have before: the ability to read the ground, not perfectly, not like a lifelong miner, but enough to notice patterns others overlooked. Where others saw risk, he saw a possibility, and beneath that discouraging surface, something massive was waiting. But enough to notice something in this forgotten stretch of land that everyone else had missed. While his main operation was still collapsing, Chris quietly started preparing for something new. This claim, the one nobody wanted, had earned its reputation. Over the past 20 years, 3 different operators had held it. Each one took a look, did some initial work, and came to the same conclusion: too much overburden, too deep, too expensive, and nothing on the surface to justify the risk. One by one, they walked away. The existing geological data didn't help much either. There hadn't been any serious investment in deep subsurface surveys. Why would there be? The surface alone was discouraging enough to kill interest. The little data that did exist only reinforced the problem, confirming the depth of the overburden and describing the layers beneath as ordinary, nothing special. Chris picked it up right after his second failed season. The price? Almost nothing. That's what happens when land sits unwanted long enough. This claim had been sitting for over a year without a single serious offer. And here's the part that makes it even more intense. Chris didn't tell his previous investors. He bought it himself, out of his own pocket, after already taking heavy losses. By any standard logic, it was a terrible decision. But Chris wasn't operating on standard logic anymore. He had just spent 2 seasons learning, the hard way, what bad ground looks like. And something about this place didn't fit that pattern. The difference wasn't obvious, it was subtle. During his second failed season, while everything around him was falling apart, Chris had done something most people in that situation don't. He studied deep placer gold systems in the Yukon, how they form, the geological events that bury rich deposits beneath layers that look completely worthless from the surface, the exact conditions that can hide something valuable under something discouraging. And suddenly, this claim started to make sense. That 100 feet of overburden, it wasn't random. It was the result of a massive geological event, a movement of earth that had buried an older valley floor. Surveys had been looking at the top layer and treating it as the primary geology, without really considering what might be underneath. But if that original valley floor was still intact below, and the evidence suggested it was, then there was a real possibility that a gold-rich placer system had been preserved down there, untouched, protected, hidden from every survey that didn't go deep enough, and from every operator who wasn't willing to take the risk. Previous miners had seen the same numbers, the cost of removing 100 feet of material versus the uncertainty of what lay below. For them, it didn't add up. Chris ran those numbers too, but now his perspective was different. 2 brutal seasons had taught him lessons no textbook could. A winter of research had sharpened his understanding, and the pressure of losing millions forced him to think differently. Even then, the math still didn't look good on paper. The cost was huge, the reward was unknown. Any standard analysis would say, don't do it. But Chris didn't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore. He needed funding, and not from the same investors. Those relationships had already been stretched too far. He needed someone new, someone who would judge the idea on its own merit, not his past failures. Eventually, he found that person. Through a connection, Chris was introduced to a small private investment group. The lead investor had an interesting background. He had built his fortune on an idea that everyone else had dismissed as unrealistic. He knew what it felt like to go against conventional thinking, and win. That made him open to hearing Chris out. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Chris laid everything on the table: the geology, the theory of the buried valley, the research on deep placer systems, the small but crucial clues in the existing survey data. And importantly, he didn't hide his past failures. He explained them. What went wrong, what they taught him, why those lessons actually made this new plan stronger. At the end of it all, the investor asked just one question. If you're wrong, if you move all that material and there's nothing there, what happens to you? Chris didn't hesitate. "I'm finished," he said. "Financially and professionally. This is it." The investor paused, studying him carefully. "Last bets tend to sharpen focus," he said. Chris nodded. "They do." That was enough. The funding came through. And just like that, Chris Doumit had one final shot. Back in the Klondike, everything came down to a single, brutal task: moving 100 feet of overburden. There's nothing exciting about that kind of work. No gold, no immediate reward. Just heavy machinery, long hours, and money disappearing day after day with nothing to show for it. For Chris, those weeks were the toughest part of the entire journey. Every day he was betting everything he had left on something he couldn't yet see. But this time, he ran things differently. Every cost was tracked tightly. Every decision was deliberate. The mistakes from his earlier operations had shaped a new kind of discipline. There was no room for inefficiency, no tolerance for loose management. This wasn't just another mining season. This was everything. Standards that made sure the kind of mid-season breakdowns that once cost him precious time wouldn't happen again. This time, everything was tighter. His crew was small but highly skilled, hand-picked, paid well, not just fairly, but in recognition that they were committing to something uncertain, something risky. Everyone on site understood what this operation meant. The digging began, layer by layer. Chris didn't just remove overburden blindly, he studied it. Every layer was compared against the geological model he had built. The mass movement deposit had a specific structure, a pattern described in the research he'd spent months absorbing. And as the excavation went deeper, the model kept proving itself right. Then, at around 60 feet, something changed. The material started to feel different. The texture shifted. The behavior under the equipment wasn't the same anymore. Chris recognized it immediately. This was the transition zone, the boundary between the deposited overburden and the original valley floor beneath it. He picked up the phone and called his geological consultant, the same one who had backed his theory during the funding stage. "We've hit the contact zone," Chris said. "Exactly where we expected it." "That's a good sign," the consultant replied cautiously. "It means your model is accurate, at least to this depth. But what's below? That's still the unknown." "I know," Chris said, "but everything's lining up." "Keep going," the consultant told him. "Call me when you break through." That moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in the 6th week of the operation. Chris wasn't watching from a distance. He was in the excavator himself. He wasn't about to miss this. As the bucket cut deeper, something shifted. Instantly. He felt it before he even fully realized it. The resistance changed. The way the ground responded was different. Everything about the material changed. He stopped the machine immediately, climbed down, dropped into the pit, and picked up a handful of earth from below the boundary. He turned it over in his hands slowly. 2 seasons of failure had taught him something no book ever could: how to feel the ground. And right there, standing at the bottom of a 100-foot excavation on land nobody believed in, his instincts, his experience, everything he'd learned was telling him the same thing. This was it. He climbed back up and made the call. "We're through," he said. "What does it look like?" the consultant asked. Chris paused for just a second. "Like gold," he said. "A lot of it." That evening, they ran the first batch through the wash plant. Nobody suggested stopping early. They worked into the night, under artificial lights. Because after everything, 2 failed seasons, 1 last gamble, and weeks of digging through nothing, this was the moment. The first results came in. They weighed the gold once, then again, then a 3rd time. Chris sat with the number and made another call. "To the investor," he said. "First run results." He gave him the figure. Silence. Then the investor asked, "That's per run?" "Per run," Chris confirmed. Another pause. "How consistent will that be?" Chris looked out at the exposed valley floor, at the stockpiled material waiting for the next day, at the model that had just proven itself right. "Very," he said. "It's going to be very consistent." And it was. For 9 weeks, the operation ran below that contact zone. 9 straight weeks of processing untouched valley floor, ground that had been buried and preserved for ages. No previous miner had reached it. No equipment had ever touched it. No serious analysis had ever been done beyond the surface, and the gold was exactly where it was supposed to be. Not just present, consistent. Run after run, week after week, the results held steady. The same strong recovery. The same confirmation that the theory was right. The geological consultant documented everything carefully. Particle size, structure, mineral patterns. All of it matched the formation model Chris had built from his research. This wasn't luck, it was understanding. And that documentation did more than prove the discovery. It allowed them to estimate what was still left. Because what they mined in those 9 weeks was only part of it. A detailed reserve assessment showed that large sections of the valley floor remained untouched. Based on the data, it wasn't just a one-season success. It was years of production still sitting there. When everything was calculated, the gold already recovered, and the reserves still in the ground. Independent evaluators placed the total value at around $300 million. Chris read that report sitting in the same site trailer he'd used all season, at a simple folding table covered in maps, reports, and production logs. He thought back to the moment his first operation had collapsed, the cold, clear conversation with his accountant. Numbers that didn't care about effort, hope, or determination. He thought about the investors he'd disappointed, the difficult conversations, the weight of those losses. He thought about the claim nobody wanted, about the 100 feet of overburden, about that Tuesday afternoon, when his hands told him the truth before the machines did. Then he made the calls he'd been waiting to make. He reached out to his former investors, not to boast, not to prove anything, but to close the chapter properly. "I found it," he told them. "Not on the old ground, on new ground, the kind I only recognized because of what the old ground taught me." There was always a pause. "I know it doesn't recover your losses," he added, "but what I learned from it wasn't wasted." One of those investors, the one who had lost the most, said something Chris would later repeat often. "I didn't invest in you because I thought you'd make me money," he said. "I invested because you understood the ground, and you were honest about what you didn't understand." He paused. "People who know what they don't know, those are the ones worth backing." Another pause. "Sounds like you figured it out." Chris let out a small breath. "Took longer than I wanted." "It usually does," the investor replied. And that's really what this story is about. Chris Doumit's $300 million discovery isn't just a success story. It's one of the most expensive lessons ever learned in gold mining. The losses were real, the damage was real, and based on what anyone could see at the time, the conclusion people reached about him made sense. What they couldn't see was what those failures were building. 2 brutal seasons that taught him something no shortcut ever could. How to recognize bad ground. And more importantly, how to recognize ground that looks bad but isn't. That's the difference. The miners before him weren't wrong. They judged the claim based on what they could see, and what they saw told them to walk away. Chris saw deeper, because failure had trained him to. 100 feet of overburden, 2 seasons that could have ended everything, 1 final bet. And beneath it all, $300 million waiting for the one person who had learned enough, the hard way, to find it. The ground didn't change. Chris did. And sometimes that's all it takes. Subscribe, because someone who comes back from losing millions to finding hundreds of millions isn't finished. They're just getting started. And the most dangerous person in any field is the one who learned everything the hard way and now knows exactly how to use it. How?